And here I would like to take a moment to tell you about a conversation that I had many years ago with a professor of, if I'm not mistaken, of psychology, child psychology, and neurology. His name was Professor Steinberg, if I'm not mistaken, Steinberg. His first name I do not recall. He was and is, I think, well known. He was for many years in the Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Yerushalayim. And once I was speaking to him, and he said to me as follows, and it should be noted that this gentleman, Professor Steinberg, is also, I believe he's still with us in this world, is a Talmid Chachamim of some stature. He's Haredi, of Haredi background certainly, and he said to me as follows. He said, the truth is, children should not begin studying in Talmud Torah until the age of 6, as it states in the Halakha. And he says, you have no idea how many Haredi parents come to me with their 5-year-old child. They send their child to these Talmudei Torah, which are like, can be compared to some certain schools, kindergartens and primary schools in some parts of the Western world, where the parents are already planning the child's career when they're 28 or 30, and thinking in terms of which schools they will have to apply to which schools they will have to apply, and which universities they will have to study in, and which degrees they will have to receive in order to be successful as they perceive the concept of success. So the parents are under tremendous pressure, and of course this also is conveyed to the child in some way or another. At any rate, in the Haredi world, he was telling me, there are many. The Talmudei Torah don't begin at 6 or 7. Why would you do that? Simply because Chazal said so. They begin at 5. So, and in most of these Talmudei Torah, particularly the ones in the, shall we say, the Litai world, where the pressure to start studying as soon as possible is very great, they start teaching the children to read at that age, at the age of 5. In some places, even before they turn 5. Now, if a child is clever and the general level of the class is such that a lot of the kids are picking up reading, even though they're too young. Someone asked in the chat whether it's Professor Avraham Steinberg. I think that's probably the name. Yes, I believe so. So they start teaching at the age of 5 or even earlier. They start teaching them to read. First of all, they don't teach them to read necessarily in the correct fashion, the ancient traditional way of teaching children to read. And at any rate, which is a problem, which is part of the problem. And therefore, a certain percentage of these children will not pick up reading at that age. And Professor Steinberg said to me, it's not because there's something wrong with the child. They're just not ready to start reading to learn, start learning to read. If you just wait a year or half a year, everything will be fine. There's no problem. But these parents come to me, these young parents come to me with their 5-year-old who's not picking up reading like his peers in his class are doing. And they think they're convinced there's something wrong with him. He has autism, he's ADD, he's ADHD, he needs a tablet, he needs something else. They're terribly pressured and concerned. And he says to them, there's nothing wrong with your child. The problem is the Talmud Torah. They're simply teaching the child to read before he knows and should know how to read. If you wait a year, everything will be fine. And he says in almost every single case, that's usually the case. It's rare that it's not so. If it's truly the case that the child has some difficulty, that will become apparent later when the child is 6 or 7, and then perhaps some kind of assistance will be in order. But the real problem is they're simply starting too soon. I myself can tell you from my own personal experience. My youngest son was studying in a certain Talmud Torah. He was, and there, of course, you had to learn how to read when you were 5, and he was not picking up learning the reading as well as many other children in the class, and this was a tremendous problem from the perspective of the school. And I told him there's nothing wrong, just wait, and he'll be fine. No, that's not. We begin Kita Aleph, we begin first grade when the child is barely 6 years old, and the child has to read. Without that, we can't accept him. The long and the short of it is, I removed my son from that Talmud Torah, and I found one of the very few, maybe one of 2 perhaps, or something like that, in all of Yerushalayim. I found a Temani Talmud Torah, a Haredi Temani Talmud Torah. When my son got to this school, to this Talmud Torah, he could not read. 2 weeks later, and I'm being precise, 2 weeks later, he could read both Israelit and Temanith. He could read both Israeli pronunciation and Temani pronunciation, not perfectly, but quite reasonably well. Let's say 85% proficiency. 3 weeks later, he could read both ways perfectly. I timed it, I looked at it, I checked it. That's exactly what happened. The difference was they're both, the reality was that there was a process of maturation probably in his mental abilities because of the time that it had elapsed. They began teaching him, 6-8 months earlier, and his brain wasn't there yet. I remember when the month we moved him from the first school in the month of Siwan towards the end of the year. In other words, early midsummer. And as I say, within 2 and 3 weeks, he could read perfectly both Israelit and Temanith. And I attribute this to two reasons. A, the fact that he was simply maturing at a very rapid rate, as children do at that time. That's how they're designed to develop. There's no reason and no need to try and outsmart Hashem and jumpstart things before they're supposed to happen. That's how it's supposed to happen. Around that age, exactly, Keven Shesh, that's exactly when he was able to start picking it up. But the other important thing is to know how to teach to read. This Temani Mori was tremendous. Was a tremendous teacher, a wonderful person, and he knew how to teach, and it was a different method completely from how they had been trying to teach children to read in the first Talmud Torah, which was a non-Temani, non-Haredi Talmud Torah, and they were using a completely incorrect method. The standard method, which Avi Mori Alav Shalom described to me in detail, also how he was taught to read at the age of 6. By the way, he told me exactly the same thing. My father related to me many times. We began at the age of 6 to be taught to read, which is exactly what we just read now in the halakha. And he said within 2 weeks, the entire class was reading. It's exactly what he told me. And he also described to me how they were taught. They were taught in the following manner. This is mispronounced, of course, using Central European pronunciation, but they were taught Kumetz Aleph U, Kumetz Beis Bu, Kumetz Gimel Gu. In other words, you see an Aleph with this Tenuah beneath it, you pronounce it this way. You see this letter with that Tenuah, with that vowel beneath it, or above it, you pronounce it this way. And they just learned by rote. They just repeated it, and they had charts and they had books, and they repeated it time and again. I saw this done in this Temani Talmud Torah, and the results were unbelievable. So you see, to get back to the text, you see that when Chazal say something, they are not guessing or shooting from the hip. When they say Keven Shesh, Keven Sheva, that's exactly what it means. And when Rambam says Ufachut mi ben shesh en machnisim oto, he is not to be taken to the school before the age of 6. Rambam knows exactly why he's saying this, and it's entirely true. And I saw this with my own eyes. And I saw with my own eyes with regards to my son, but I also have no doubt and have heard from many people, including this Professor Steinberg, that this is a common occurrence. You take the best children from the best families with the highest IQ, you try and teach them to read in the wrong, using the wrong methodology, and B, too early. Some of the time, 20, 30, 40% will run into trouble. If you use the correct methodology, which has been used in Am Yisrael for thousands of years, and we don't need, therefore, the newfangled ideas of some professor of education in some university who has to justify his existence and his tenure by coming up with a new method for teaching how to read, which he, of course, picked up from textbooks written in English, as if you can compare reading English to reading Hebrew. The only way to teach to read English is to read globally, what's called globally. You look at the word station, and you have to figure out what you do with these letters, and it's not done phonetically, correct? It cannot be understood phonetically. You can't teach that way. So you take all kinds of ideas that these poor professors in various English-speaking or European countries come up with to try and figure out how to teach children to read this impossible language that we call English, which is written in the most impossible way, because for all kinds of historical reasons that we don't need to go into. We'll just mention the fact that you take the Roman alphabet, which was not designed for an Anglo-Saxon language or the French language or the Hungarian language, and you force the round peg into a square hole. So you don't have a sh, you don't have a consonant sh in English, in Latin. So what do? When in English you do have such a consonant? So you have to come up with some combination of letters. So in English it's sh, in French it's ch, in other languages it's something else, and there are other sounds which don't exist in Latin, but do exist in Bosnian or whatever it is, and you have to come up with some combination, and it's all very convoluted and very complicated. So you can only teach to read globally. But Hebrew, the brilliance of the system of the alphabet, which originated with the Jewish people, despite the fact that some archaeologists like to claim it's Phoenician, because they just like to remove from us anything that we have done and hand it over to somebody else. But in fact, the Jews are the earliest people known to have used such an alphabet, and we have found in archaeological finds tablets on which children were practicing to write the letters, going back 3,000 years in simple agricultural settlements in Eretz Israel. It's quite amazing, but that's the truth of the matter. So the alphabet is simple, straightforward, and it entirely dovetails with the language, with the consonants, with the sounds of that language. So if there's a sh consonant, there is also a letter which is a sh. If there is whatever sound you have is immediately reproduced or represented by a certain image, by one letter, not a combination of letters for one thing. Then of course you have the vowels. So if you teach how to read phonetically, it's actually very straightforward.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.